Greetings, listeners. So this is the second little reaction piece for the 2024 American election. And I just want to make a couple points about the election. One is directed towards my fellow American citizens. Some of them are in shock that such a thing happened. I'm not in shock. I fully expected this. I knew this was going to happen. I knew there was very little I could do to stop it. I could protest against it, but I knew something like authoritarian kleptocracy was going to take over the United States. But the other audience is, folks from outside of America who are wondering, whose image of America is that of a modern industrial polity, and they're just stunned at the patent political regression that's been happening over the last 20 years in the United States. And that's largely an artifact of the fact that people outside the United States have a very distorted view of what's happening inside the United States, and people inside the United States don't really know what's going on either due to some conditions of imperial provincialism. So, 2 points. Number one, Trumpism won, but not because Trumpism is in any way, shape, or form popular or the ideology of most Americans. Not true. Trumpism won this particular election because the United States no longer has a middle class. It just doesn't. It doesn't. For roughly 45 years now, both political parties have been running campaigns. The Republicans and the Democrats in the United States have been running political campaigns to try to appeal to a middle class which is shrinking. And it's been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. In the 1980s, about 2/3 of Americans were middle class in terms of income and status and wealth and education. By 2000, that number had dropped to half. After the end of the 2007-2009 recession, only about 1/3 of Americans could be said to be middle class. Here in 2024, according to the latest data, about 1 in 4 Americans live in middle class conditions. And by middle class conditions, I mean middle class according to the standard of life of the fully industrialized countries. There are 36 of them: Japan, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the European countries, the United States. Only 36 of them on the planet. A very high standard of living, high GDP, but huge variations in that group. So middle class, according to that group and that standard, America, only 1 in 4 Americans belongs to that condition. 3 in 4 Americans, including myself, live outside of that. And we live in the social conditions of a semi-periphery, not a core polity, fully industrialized, but social conditions that are much more similar to those of the middle-income nations. Brazil, Argentina, Turkey, Ukraine, Indonesia, on and on and on and on, China, India, and so forth. I know that sounds like a shocking thing, and I'm sure a lot of you in the audience are just laughing and you're tuning away, and I don't care. I do not care. I'm not here to reinforce any of your prejudices about the United States. I'm here to tell you the truth. And the truth is that 3 in 4 Americans actually don't belong to the core polities anymore. That 3 in 4 live in a middle-income universe, a middle-income world, a middle-income state of mind, and in middle-income conditions. This is the best way to explain this is that even though the GDP of the United States is very high, so it looks productive and rich from the outside, but there are a number of huge monopolies run by plutocrats that systematically fleece Americans and prevent them from being middle class. So you have this big income, but it's eaten up by these institutions, which are sort of semi-invisible and hard to get a hold of. But the institutions are essential for your well-being, for your existence. Anywhere you look, you'll find these institutions and these monopolies fleecing Americans. So the United States of America, healthcare, one of the classic examples. Healthcare is overpriced and tremendously bad in terms of the outcomes. Life expectancy is incredibly low, at only 79. The average person in Japan lives to 84. The average person in Europe can live to 81, 82. People only live to the age of 79 in the United States because they don't get the care or the care is mismanaged. Small number of people, big pharma, big medical, big hospital, get the profits, and most people don't get the care that they need. Housing in the United States is incredibly unaffordable because real estate and zoning are monopolies. They really are. The food you can buy in the United States, aside from a few areas where there are boutique bakeries or immigrant communities providing decent food, but in many parts of the United States, the food supply is awful and groceries are overpriced because food monopolies. Okay? Internet speed in the United States is terribly slow, and cell phones and ISPs are terribly overpriced compared to other countries because ISP and digital cell phone monopolies. There are only a small number of providers. There's very little competition, on and on and on. Mass transit in the United States is frequently terrible, and walkable communities barely exist. You have to buy a car because automobile monopolies. Okay, on and on and on. So all these institutions of life are monopolies. Education is a monopoly. There are small number of institutions, and you have to take on huge amounts of student loan debt if you want to go to school because there's no public support for education, and it ends up you go into debt to get this degree. The degree is useful, but you end up with this huge amount of debt you can't possibly pay off. So education has been turned into a form of upwards income redistribution. So you go into this heavy amount of debt to pay for something that should be free, education should be free, and spend the rest of your life paying off this loan, which means that you don't have the money to enjoy your life or to pay for anything. So the basic political problem of the United States, to make this long story short, right now there is no party trying to win the votes of the 75%. It doesn't exist. Both parties, they're financed by billionaires. They harvest money from billionaires. They pass legislation for, of, and by billionaires. They coddle the billionaires. It's just that they appeal to different fractions of the billionaires. One party has Phelan Husk, the other has Bloomberg, but it's a wash. Okay, the 75% are locked out of the political system and have been for almost 40 years. Now, this explains our election system, because if your two candidates are both financed and paid for by billionaires, that's not a choice. And this is borne out in the statistics. Like, how many Americans actually voted for Trumpism in 2020? 74 million. Only 74 million out of 257 million adults who would be eligible to vote. So it's 28.9%. So 29%. Okay. There's a little more than 1 in 4 Americans voted for Trumpism back in 2020. How many Americans voted for Trumpism in 2024? Some huge wave? No. About 75 million. A little more. They're still counting in California, but around 75 million, 75, 76. Out of 269 million adults. 27.9%. So about 28%. Again, a little over 1 in 4. Not the majority. No, literally, not the majority. Why did Trumpism win in 2024 and not 2020? Because Biden got 81 million back in 2020, considerably more. About 1 in 3 voters voted for Biden back then. But very few people voted for Harris in 2024. And so there's a difference of 9 to 10 million voters who stayed home in 2024. If those voters show up to the polls and vote, then there's this massive blue wave. Then the Democrats run the country and get both parties of Congress, no question. But those people stayed home. They stayed home because they couldn't figure out the difference between an HR officer, Harris, and a reality TV star, Trumpism. They're like, okay, neither was appealing. There's small groups that found both appealing, but the vast majority of adults didn't see anything that they liked. And so they just stayed home. Now, this is not to say, please don't misread this. This is not to say that there are no differences between the candidates and that it doesn't matter in that sense. Oh, no, it doesn't matter. Trumpism is a catastrophe. Okay? And the results are going to be horrific for ordinary Americans. I'm not going to be too grim here, but the Americans watching this feed should really understand that this is going to be catastrophic. Okay, this is really going to be a catastrophe for ordinary people, because these people are going to wreck every last functioning public infrastructure, and they have total control of the government, and they're just going to be a wrecking ball, and there will be nothing left after 4 years. We're going to see some really, really horrible stuff over the next 4 years, to the point where the broken democracy that exists in the United States will turn wildly dysfunctional. And there will be political consequences for this, deep political consequences, very bad ones for Americans. Less so for the rest of the planet, because increasingly the United States increasingly matters less and less in the world system. That's a subject for another podcast. But anyway, so that's the long and short of it, is that in a country that doesn't have a middle class, and you have this completely corrupt political system, and you have very poor levels of education, and you have this history of hegemony. A lot of Americans think of themselves as masters of the world, and we don't need to learn anything from them. They're foreigners. And the result is going to be just an absolute disaster. Now, this does not mean that we put our heads in the sand. This does not mean that we despair. This does not mean that we give up. Okay? Absolutely not. If you're an American and you believe in democracy, and you believe in a better life for your community and people around you and your friends and family and children, and just in general, there are 4 things that you can do. Okay? 4 things, 4 simple things. No tricks, but there are 4 things that you can do. But the issue is that you have to be willing to do those things. Okay? If you do one of these 4 things, then you're on the right track, and you can help your country to go in a better direction. Because bad things are coming, but the only way to fight the bad stuff is to act for some good purpose, some good end to things. Okay. Number 1, the very first thing you can do is simply to leave the plutocrat-owned mass media platforms. Just leave them. Don't bother with them. Okay. So if you're on Twitter, leave Twitter. It's a sewage pipe of grift and crime and mandatory advertising and algorithms. They're just designed to waste your time. Use Bluesky. It was an actual community, an actual news service, and has actual algorithms run by the communities that are online there. It's not perfect, there are the usual issues, but it's what Twitter used to be, a place where you sort of meet people and run into things and get news. So Bluesky, growing very quickly. Close the Twitter account, don't give Phelan Husk any more cash, move to a digital community that's actually functional. The second thing, those of you in the social sciences, I strongly encourage you to read, study, and learn the work of Michael Pettis, an economist that works in Beijing, teaches there. He's given extensive interviews on the Chinese economy, but he has a wonderful model that explains a lot of why the world economy is dysfunctional and why the United States is in this deep crisis. Listen to what he has to say about the world system, about economics, about economic imbalances, because that's the real story behind the story of Trumpism. Trumpism is sort of a reaction to the world that neoliberalism created, this very unfair world of incredible imbalances, and Plutofascism is a response to this. But as to why and how we can fix this, we have to fix the imbalances. Read Pettis, and you'll get a better understanding of how things work, on our planet. The third thing you can do, support the people of Ukraine. You don't necessarily have to send money or volunteer or enlist. Those are all wonderful things. Learn its history. Appreciate its language. Read its novels, its poets, its writers. Watch its films, its filmmakers, its TV, its video. Play its video games. Learn from Ukraine, because the Ukrainian people have been fighting against varieties of imperialism and fascism for a long, long time, and that means they have a very, very rich and complex tradition of resistance of all forms, political, cultural, psychological, social, everything under the sun. And this is an incredible bequest, a gift to all of us on this planet. They've invented a lot of tools which will be very useful to ordinary Americans over the next 4 years. The fourth thing you can do is do what you can to resist, critique, or break up all of the monopolies that have been ruining America since forever. Okay, the healthcare monopoly, the big pharma monopoly, automobile monopoly, all these horrible monopolies. Okay, one of the best authors on this is actually Matthew Stoller, Stoller. Relatively little to say, and culture and other cultural events, but he's very good on the politics of monopolies, done the work, and he has a number of texts, a good blog that flags this stuff. And this is a big issue because this is a wedge issue where much of the rage behind Trumpism is actually rage at monopolies. And of course, Plutofascism, what it does is it takes that rage against elites and it turns it into rage against minorities and repression and war. So we have to do the opposite. We have to take that rage at minorities and immigrants and women, all the other bogus things that Plutofascism is creating, and rechannel that back to hatred and repudiation of plutocrats and their monopolies. That's the problem, because these monopolies have also created a very dysfunctional world system, which is causing all kinds of problems. Okay, so those four things. Do any one of those four things. Do all four if you can get a chance, but at least one of them, and you will have made a great contribution to democracy. Okay, or at the very least, think about some of these issues in a more complex way.